Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to be talking about episode 3 of season 3 of The Mandalorian, or chapter 19 if you like to call it that, and this one is called The Convert. And this is definitely going to be an interesting one to talk about with you guys, the audience, and everybody else who has watched and is a fan of this show, because this episode went in a very, very different direction than I think anybody was expecting out of this show, and I'm not quite sure how the audience reaction is going to be to these things. I, for one, really enjoyed what I saw in this episode, but I think I'm going to hold judgment as to what it means in this show alone until the end of the season, or what they're leading towards, because clearly this has to have something to do with the overall arc. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about spoilers for what happens in this episode of The Mandalorian, because like I said, it is an interesting one. But first, let's talk about the beginning and the end of this episode, because this episode has a sort of split identity. It's one thing entirely with Mando and Bo-Katan and the Creed and everything that has to do with the convert title of this episode, and it also follows a trend that I talked about in my last video, which is this episode starts off exactly where the last one left off, in a way that it feels like one continuous storyline instead of the little vignettes that you got in the previous Mandalorian seasons, or in Clone Wars, for instance. And the episode started and I was like, okay, sweet, we're getting a continuously long storyline through all 8 episodes, and then it cuts away and does everything on Coruscant, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in terms of the actual stuff that happened with the Mandalorian, with Djarin himself and Grogu and Bo-Katan specifically, I loved all of this stuff, because it starts off exactly where the last episode left off, with Bo-Katan really contemplating what it means to have seen the mythosaur in those waters. And what I found interesting about her character and her decisions that she made in this episode was the fact that, she asked Djarin if he saw anything in the waters, anything living that was down there, and I don't know if it's out of disbelief of what she saw, or if she's kind of plotting something in the back of her mind, because of course, at the end of the last season, she really longed for the Darksaber. She wants to rule Mandalore. She wants to be the leader that she's always been destined to be ever since she was introduced in the Clone Wars. And so I wonder if her ulterior motives in seeing the actual mythosaur in those waters, maybe that has a leg up in terms of getting the followers to follow her rather than Djarin, because yes, Djarin has the Darksaber, but in her mind, she knows how to use it. She has seen the mythosaur. Can she be the Mandalorian that can bring everybody back together? Is she the one that is talked about in all of those myths? Or is it Djarin? And because she is the one who saw the mythosaur, maybe she can start believing in this creed that Djarin has been following this entire time, because at the end of the episode, she's also redeemed from those waters, because that's exactly what they do. They have a little battle with some Imperial officers that are, flying in with these ships, and they bomb Bo-Katan's house, which was a great action sequence to kick off the episode. I was loving all of that, and just the entire thing of having Bo-Katan lose her home and have to fly off with Djarin and not be able to fight these Imperial officers who basically did the exact same thing on a smaller scale to what she experienced on Mandalore when Mandalore was bombed by these exact same type of fighters. And so she's basically reliving all these things, and she's going through all this very, very deep struggle within her mind. But once she's redeemed, and now that she knows she's seen the mythosaur, and she can kind of feel like she is the chosen one, essentially, that is going to bring Mandalore back together. And I wonder if she's building up these ulterior motives in her mind to go against Djarin and kind of be a more antagonizing threats to him, essentially, in this, because this is called The Mandalorian. It's not called Djarin. Yes, he is Mando to all of us viewers, and we know that he is the main character of this show, but for this entire season so far, I find the stuff happening with Bo-Katan the most interesting. And for one, I love Katy Sackhoff. I think she's phenomenal as this character, as the voice and as the actual actress behind the mask whenever she takes it off. But at this point, if she's going to follow through with this creed and not reveal her face and not take off her mask anymore from this point on, and kind of believe in all this stuff that, this creed believes in, or maybe she's going to betray them, or who knows what she's going to do, I find her the most fascinating character in the show so far. In terms of Djarin's storyline in this episode, he redeemed himself. Yes, he did fall and almost drown and die in that episode, and he missed the mythosaur reveal that happened in the last episode, but he did exactly what he saw out to do in that first episode, and what I thought was going to be the season-long journey for him. He redeemed himself in the eyes of the creed. This is the way. He is redeemed by everything that has happened so far in the show after his whole reveal of his face to Grogu and everything that happened in the last 2 seasons, and now he's a part of this creed, and they're being welcomed into all of this, and I really don't know where they're going to go with his character next from here, because again, they're not really doing too much with him in terms of like the character arc. Yes, we got a very simple storyline with him, with the first episode saying, oh, I need to be redeemed. He goes off, now he's redeemed. It's basically a two-step process that has happened and nothing much else. Like I said, they're focusing a lot more time on Bo-Katan, and yes, we got so much character development with Djarin in the past 2 seasons that it kind of makes sense that he's taking a bit of a step back in these first few episodes to give a little more focus to Bo-Katan, who I think is going to be possibly the main antagonist towards Djarin later on in this season. But I do wish they were giving him a little bit more to do. It's just me being such a big fan of Djarin, and I saw a couple memes on Twitter immediately after I watched this episode being like, oh, Djarin fans waiting to see like a 49-minute episode of The Mandalorian, which, you know, this show usually has a lot shorter episodes, and people got very excited for that just to reveal what it is, and there's barely any Djarin in it once again, because we cut to Coruscant in this episode and have a whole different storyline with Dr. Pershing, and that is a whole other beast to explore. And remember when I said this season was going to be a full 8-episode arc of him trying to get back to Mandalore and bring back this creed and bring back the Mandalorian people to its heights of civilization? Well, we're also going to have this little shoot-off episode where we're going to explore Dr. Pershing on Coruscant, and this is definitely a bottle episode. If you don't know what a bottle episode is, it basically means you're going to focus on a specific character and their journey in a very contained situation versus the main storyline. And bottle episodes are hit or miss when it comes to shows. I think The Walking Dead really does fail at bottle episodes, especially in those later seasons, especially the Terra episodes. I wish they had better writing for those bottle episodes and for those characters, because it never was really interesting to me. But when you have a show like The Last of Us, for instance, and you had 2 bottle episodes in that full season, which I also have a full review up for The Last of Us if you're interested in watching that review. But they had an episode 3 with Bill and Frank that was a bottle episode that I thought was phenomenal, and even a bottle episode exploring Ellie's backstory in the Left Behind DLC episode, essentially. And so, yes, it can work in a show, and I thought Last of Us is a great example of how a bottle episode can work, and I think this episode is a good storyline with Dr. Pershing. I really enjoyed all of that, but again, I'm going to hold my judgment for how this storyline fits into this show specifically until it actually starts tying itself in to the main storyline, because what The Last of Us does very well is whenever you're going through this bottle episode of Bill and Frank, you're getting a lot of this storyline of you can live in this world with love. You can explore these things. It's not a lost cause. This world can still be worth living in. And that's an important message that Joel is eventually going to kind of fall into, that relationship with Ellie and have that, you know, fatherly love for her later on in the show. And it kind of relates to the themes of that show in general. But that is that type of show. In this show, it feels like a Clone Wars episode where we kind of just had a little offshoot thing that is still in the universe of Star Wars. And it feels like yet another episode of Star Wars, the TV show, rather than The Mandalorian, the TV show. And I think that's something that also happened with the Book of Boba Fett, with the Mandalorian episodes within that show, which I honestly think we all have to kind of accept the fact that all these Disney Plus Mandalorian era shows are really just going to be Star Wars, the Mandalorian time period show, the series, essentially. So I think that's, of course, you have the Mandalorian, you have the Book of Boba Fett, and now you're going to have Ahsoka and a few other shows, and I think they're all going to tie in to storylines. They're all going to have little offshoots leading to something that's going to build up between all of these shows continuously. Maybe we'll get like a movie event out of it. Maybe we'll get a crossover Avengers type movie that kind of caps off this entire thing, or maybe a series that caps off this entire thing. And I think that is what this episode is setting up. If I'm going to theorize about anything, that is what I'm going to theorize. And to talk about the actual content within this episode with Dr. Pershing, essentially he's on Coruscant and we get to see what this world is like under the rule of the New Republic. But again, I liked all the content that we got in this episode. It's not like this offshoot storyline on Coruscant was uninteresting to me, because I love seeing Coruscant and the state that it's in, no matter what point in the galaxy we are or in the timeline that we are. Because in Andor, we got a lot of Coruscant stuff in that, and we got to see Coruscant under the rule or under the harsh thumb of the Empire. And in this, we get to see what Coruscant was like under the rule of the New Republic, and you get to see that it might not be too different. And especially if you are a watcher of the Andor show and you know how it was explored in that, and you've seen the prequels and you know how Coruscant, you know, ruled under the prequel movies and also the Clone Wars show, and you get to see how it's evolved over time. I find all that very fascinating, but especially comparing it between Andor and this, it's honestly very, very similar. It's not like the New Republic has really learned all the lessons from the fall of the Empire and everything that happened with that, because they really haven't. So essentially, Dr. Pershing is a part of this amnesty program, which basically has a bunch of old Imperial officers all being rehabilitated into into the New Republic. And so he is kind of on this ground level. He's in his own little cubicle, essentially deleting all this old information from the Empire. And I think this really does apply to real life as well. If you ignore the past and ignore all the mistakes that you made as a government in the past before, you're going to be doomed to repeat it, which is exactly what we see later on in the series with the sequel trilogy, with the rise of the First Order. So you can kind of see the pieces of the puzzle being put together. And I said this in a review before. I'm not sure whether it was the Rise of Skywalker review or if it was just any other review for maybe the Mandalorian season 2 after the whole cloning idea was planted inside of that show. I can see Star Wars doing like an animated series, or I guess in this show itself, kind of piecing together these storylines to fix the plot holes of the sequel trilogy when it comes to Palpatine and how he returned. And of course, we have the idea of cloning that was set up in season 2 of The Mandalorian with Grogu, or I guess that was set up right from the beginning. And so I know these storytellers with Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau know what they're doing with what they want to do with Dr. Pershing and this cloning idea. And I definitely thought that officer who was working with Moff Gideon was definitely manipulating him into believing that he was going to work for, the New Republic. He's going to be doing good things with his scientific exploration by manipulating him with nostalgia of his old work and his old science, and making him really want to pursue this technology of cloning that could possibly be used to help the New Republic at large, because his mother died from organ failure, and if she was able to get that replaced by this cloning technology, maybe she could have lived. And so they get a little backstory to Dr. Pershing that he wasn't necessarily a bad person. He was inducted into the Empire because that is what the world was at the time that he was pursuing this science. And now in the New Republic, they don't want to pursue that anymore. They find that dangerous because of the Clone Wars, because of everything that happened there. And so again, all this stuff is very fascinating to me, and I can see him being manipulated by this officer who was working with Moff Gideon to get him to pursue the science in a similar way that Galen Erso was manipulated into building the Death Star tech in the Catalyst book that was a tie-in to Rogue One, which if you have not read that book, it's a very great book. But that's what I thought was happening. But by the end of the episode, Elia Kane reveals that she's been working with the New Republic instead, and he is brought into this essentially torture chamber where he puts on this helmet and he says, "This is a mind flare. You're going to erase my memories. You're going to destroy my mind," in I guess this way of punishing him for kind of falling back into that technology that the Empire was pursuing. And maybe that is a good thing in terms of the grand scheme of the universe, because we know cloning is going to be used to bring up the First Order and Palpatine and all these things that happen in the future. But also the way they're going about it is very harsh and just, it's torture essentially. And that's kind of exploring the fact that this New Republic is no better than the Empire, which I think is an interesting direction that this series of Star Wars is going in this universe, which I find that really fascinating. But again, I don't know the ulterior motives behind Elia Kane. Is she actually still working for Moff Gideon? Is she working for Palpatine or those people around Palpatine that's eventually going to build up the First Order? I don't really know what her role is in the Star Wars universe just yet, because we know that she is a bad person. She cranks up that scale to torture Pershing even more in that little pod that he's in by the end of the episode. So who knows how this is going to relate to Star Wars as a whole in terms of how it's leading up to the sequel trilogy, or to, I guess, the Mandalorian show itself, because right now it feels like these two storylines are very dissonant. They feel very, very opposite sides of the spectrum. And one thing I do love about the Mandalorian show is the fact that we get to see all corners of the universe through the lens of this character that we all love. And I think eventually we're going to cross these two storylines over together. But right now, I just don't see how that's going to go. The overall through line of this series, or at least of this season, I thought was going to be a quest to reclaim Mandalore. And yes, these Imperial, ships flew in and attacked and was trying to gain control. And maybe there's something about Mandalore that has to do with the rise of this cloning technology, or whatever they're going to do with Dr. Pershing and the New Republic and whatever they're setting up here in this episode. I just can't see what they're doing with it quite yet. And I find that a little bit frustrating. But again, we're only 3 episodes into the season, and we will learn exactly what they're doing with this. And if we get to the end of the season and we still don't know how in the world this is connected, if we never come back to this, which again, I highly doubt that's going to happen, but say it does, in a hypothetical world that they never go back to this storyline within this season of The Mandalorian, I'll be extremely confused with this episode. But this is where I pass it off to you guys. You guys might be a bigger Star Wars expert than I am, so if you think you know where they're going with this storyline, or you just have your own general thoughts about this episode of The Mandalorian, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. And again, I want to express that I did really enjoy this episode. I loved everything that we saw on Coruscant in this episode, and it did feel a little bit disjointed, but I can see maybe that they can tie this thing together and make it feel worth it. I thought Lee Isaac Chung did a great job directing this episode. I'm curious to see what else he does in the Star Wars universe in terms of this show. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you guys leave it a like and also subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. I'm going to have weekly reviews out for this show as well as other different movies that we're releasing throughout the year. I'm going to be talking about Shazam! Fury of the Gods very soon here as well. So thanks everybody for watching this video, and I hope to see you all in my next one.